Now on Big Ten Today, Hoosier insider Zach Osterman weighs in on a football program testing uncharted waters in Bloomington and a hoop squad bonding in paradise. Our training camp tour has made its way to the banks of the Raritan for Rutgers practice. We offer a first-hand take on what the birthplace could deliver in 2025. Plus, the conference reigns supreme on the court once again, where the preseason volleyball rankings show why Husker hopes are sky high. This is Big Ten Today. With that, welcome to Inside this edition of Big Ten Today. I'm your host, Rick Pizzo. Excited to get our training camp tour crew's take on Rutgers practice. Supposed to be a phenomenal roster for Greg Schiano and the Scarlet Knights heading into 2025. And we'll talk Big Ten volleyball in a bit as well. But we begin with the big story. And he is perhaps the one man who believed it could happen in Bloomington. Curt Cignetti's 2024 Indiana football team backed up nearly every one of his bold predictions on its way to the college football playoff. So why would we ever think that Coach Sig would consider changing the message just because the Hoosiers are hoping to run it back?
Every team, regardless of your record the year before, you got to start at ground zero in January. And we're very process-oriented, buy into the process, improve daily. No limitations on what you can accomplish, get consistency and performance, high standards, don't lower your standards. And if you prepare right, you write your ticket, so to speak. The key is doing all those things, being able to handle success, being able to handle failure. You know, I see this team improving, but we still have a long way to go.
And Zach Osterman is joining us for the big interview, and he joins us from the tropical confines of Puerto Rico, where he is covering the Indiana basketball program. We'll get to the Hoosier football team in just a bit. But first, Zach, give us a sense of what's going on down there with Darren DeVries and the team.
Yeah, so last night Indiana played the first of 3 games down here in its preseason tour of Puerto Rico. Won 98-47 against a local team. I think probably the least competitive of the 3 games that they'll play here. But I think Darren DeVries really was more just looking for, and I think he saw, you know, sort of basically his team absorbed what he was sort of getting over to them across the last 2 months. You get those 10 practices before you go on a preseason tour. I think those would have been more important for him with 13 new scholarship players, 11 of whom are on this tour. 1 is back home, 1 is not in the U.S. yet. But I think he was more just looking for proof of concept, more just looking for proof that his team has really been able to absorb what he's kind of been preaching, his philosophies, what he's been trying to lay into his program across this summer. And I think it's one preseason game, but I think he felt good about what he saw Wednesday night.
You know what the expectations are from the fan base and people who follow Indiana basketball. What do you think Coach DeVries' realistic expectations are in year one?
I mean, he said he made some offhand comment about last night about how basically we're here to win. I don't think he's putting sort of limits on his expectations. I think everyone is understanding in the sense that when you turn a roster over entirely, the way that Indiana has, even if you have some encouraging players coming in out of the portal, even if you've got, you know, some high profile wins, particularly with those transfers, there are still going to be moments when things are a little bit rocky. There's still going to be a bit of a learning curve for all these players to get together. I think that's the primary reason why DeVries wanted those 10 practices and then this preseason tour was to try and flatten that in the summer as much as possible. But I don't think he's not talking about rebuilding. He's not talking about a 3-year cycle or a 5-year cycle. I'm not sure you'd even get away with a 5-year cycle anymore in college sports. You know, he is, I think, bent on winning now and using that as a platform for what he does going forward.
As you mentioned, really hard to win when you turn over a roster almost entirely. Of course, Curt Cignetti did something like that a year ago. No one expected Indiana football to do what it did in 2024. And he could use the rallying cry with those guys. No one believes in us. Let's shock the world. That's not the case this year. So how much different does it feel heading into 2025?
It definitely feels a little bit different. I don't know if his players would agree with me when I say that. I think it feels different almost more from the perspective of someone who spends as much time facing fans and readers as I do facing the team, in the sense that I think fans, not that there are sort of outlandish expectations. I don't think anyone is talking about national championships in Bloomington, but I think fans are just genuinely pleased to be given a reason to be excited again. They built so much of that up after those 2 seasons under Tom Allen, the Gator Bowl year, the Outback Bowl year, and then, of course, that 2021 season just sort of ends so disastrously. I think there's a feeling that maybe this is something a little bit more lasting, a little bit more solid that they can buy into, not least because of Curt Cignetti's track record, not just at Indiana, but throughout his entire career. I think internally, though, you still have a lot of those players that, were at 6-0 last year, at 9-0 last year. Frankly, even at 11-2 after the Notre Dame game last year, we're saying we're not satisfied. This was not enough for us. This was not where we set the bar. You still have your Aiden Fishers, your Elijah Surratts, your Mikhail Camaras, your Carter Smiths, players that were always comfortable last year pushing Indiana's ambitions further than anyone expected them to. And I don't think that's going to stop going into this year. Of course, there are questions to answer. You've got to retool that defensive line. You've got a new starting quarterback. But I don't think that ambition is suddenly going to be limited within that group.
That new starting quarterback is Cal transfer Fernando Mendoza. What should we know about him?
In some ways, you could argue he is more credentialed than the quarterback he replaces. Curtis Rourke had a lot more time on task, but Mendoza's done it at the Power 4 level. So it's sort of a choose-your-fighter kind of situation, I suppose, there. He threw for 3,000-plus yards last year. He had 30 touchdowns across, I think, about 19 starts in the last 2 seasons at Cal. Of course, led Cal to back-to-back bowl games. The thing the stat that really struck me was he went from 24.3 attempts per interception redshirt freshman year to 64.3 attempts per interception his redshirt sophomore year, despite getting sacked 41 times. So despite a real lack of pass protection, he got a lot more efficient last season for Cal. I think the next step for Mendoza really is, can he, first of all, trust his offensive line? That's something Curt Cignetti's talked a lot about since the spring, that he's got a better offensive line in front of him, but he's got to learn to trust it. And then can he command an offense that is probably going to bring more weapons into play than maybe what he had at Cal when he was focused on 2 or 3 players? Indiana's got, I think, 2 potential all-conference wide receivers. It's got a really good revamped running back room, some promising tight ends. Indiana's going to put a lot on his plate. They're going to expect a lot from him, just like they always do Curt Cignetti quarterbacks. But at the same time, whether they're transfers or even true freshmen, Cignetti has a remarkable history within his offense of first-year quarterbacks finding a lot of success. There is just something about his approach and Mike Shanahan's approach as offensive coordinator that smooths that road for first-year QBs. We saw it at JMU. We saw it at Elon. We saw it last year at Indiana, and I think IU's confident they can do it again.
Zach, you mentioned some of the stars returning defensively. I believe Indiana is the only team in the country that has a returning all-conference player, first-team all-conference player at all 3 levels, that being Kamara, Fisher, and D'Angelo Pons. What's the ceiling for those guys in 2025?
I think a lot of that is going to be determined by what happens around them, because if you look at every one of those position groups, you kind of have those stalwarts, you have those anchors for Bryant Haynes that you talked about, and I would even throw Amari Farrell, who was a borderline all-conference safety last year, into that mix. But you're going to be breaking in starters almost everywhere else. I think Tyrick Tucker steps in at defensive tackle, but he was a reserve last year. Around him are nothing but transfers. You've got some young guys at linebacker that Indiana likes, but they're going to have to replace a really, really talented player who played next to Aiden Fisher for a really long time in Jalen Walker. That chemistry, in addition to their talent, was just off the charts for Indiana, was so important last season. And then you do have a lot to sort out between the second corner position, the second safety position, what Indiana calls the rover position, which is that 5th defensive back. The point is, Indiana's got a sort of a proven, known commodity at every level of its defense, like you talked about. But then everywhere else, Indiana's got questions that it needs to answer between what it did in the spring and what it's done here in the fall. And I think the strength for Bryant Haynes, Indiana's defensive coordinator, is that in that, core 4, if you want to use that term, he's got players he knows can produce within his system. So he knows he can kind of anchor what he's trying to do around those guys. And it's about filling in around them that I think determines, to your point, what the ceiling is for those 3 or 4 players. Because if they have to carry too much of a load, then maybe they wear down over the course of the season. But if Indiana can get that blend right with some transfers, I think even some freshmen like a Byron Baldwin at safety, wouldn't be shocked if you see a fair bit of him this fall, then I think you're going to get the best out of what is a really, really good top of the defensive depth chart.
All right, Zach, one final question, about 30 seconds here. I'd love to get your thoughts on the schedule. It was the one area where Indiana was criticized last year, or at least it was suggested part of their success was because of the easier schedule. How does this year's slate compare?
It certainly looks tougher on paper. Of course, we said last year's schedule looked plenty tough, and it wound up not being. But with Illinois at home, Iowa, Oregon, Penn State on the road, you would have a hard time believing that the bottom could come out from under that schedule the way Indiana's schedule kind of did in 2024. I think for Indiana, it also sets up nicely because you get 3 really manageable non-conference games. Then your first big test is at home. Then if we're grading these 3 road games, Iowa is probably the most manageable. So you get to sort of reset after those first 5 weeks with a bye. Then you got the big game against Oregon, a couple home games to sort of, again, catch your breath, reset a little bit, and then you build toward that game. If you are still in the playoff conversation going into November, if you are still maybe even in the Big Ten title conversation in November, you have a little bit of time to catch your breath going into that Penn State game on November 8th. It gives Indiana a nice way to pace itself through the schedule, and it gives us, you know, as reporters, as pundits, whatever, a real ability to sort of almost grade Indiana at a nice rhythm along the way. I think it's a really fascinating schedule.
Zach, we appreciate the time. Back to the tropical paradise you go. Plenty of sunscreen and lots of water, my friend.
Plenty of sunscreen. I have an Irish complexion, so plenty of sunscreen.
And plenty more on the Hoosiers coming up later this week as our Indiana football training camp show featuring Dave Revson, Jerry Donardo, and Howard Griffith makes its debut Friday night at 8 o'clock Eastern, 5 Pacific. Our focus now turns to Rutgers football, a program that won 4 conference games in 2024, tied for the team's second most league wins this century. Our training camp crew made its way to the birthplace for a Scarlet Knights practice, and that's where Dave Revson and Jake Butt anchor our coverage.
Thanks, Rick. Yes, indisputable progress being made here at Rutgers, best back-to-back seasons in a dozen years. And so now after watching them practice, Jake, how do they continue this progress? What did you see?
Well, I think at this point, year 6 for Coach Schiano, the roster is where he wants it to be. It's got his fingerprints all over it. The trenches stood out, particularly offensive line, defensive line, and that's Big Ten football. And, you know, what's cool about going on these camp tours is you get to see the identity of each program. And one thing that is certain is when Rutgers football takes the field, there's going to be a brand and emphasis of physicality. That showed up in practice today. You know, it's going to look a little bit different this fall on the offensive side of the ball. It's extremely valuable to have a veteran quarterback in Ethan Kaliakmanis that has a long relationship with this play caller, Kirk Shiraka. I think the offensive line is going to be able to establish the run. Ethan looked different in practice today because he had time, and that's when the weapons showed up outside. Guys like Ian Strong, KJ Duff, I know we're high on both of them. Those are big, long, strong wide receivers that are going to be able to make plays and contested catches.
Now, that wide receiver group was really impressive today. I mean, Strong and Duff, who were high school teammates, they got the transfer Sheffield, who had a nice day. They have some holdovers who popped a little bit. It feels like that's a group that's really going to challenge people. The way that they moved the ball the best last year, and really the last 2 years, was running it with Kyle Monungai. It was over 1,200 yards each of those 2 years. He is no longer here. So I know you spoke to the trenches and the offensive line. How about the guys who will be carrying the ball? I mean, what did you think of that group of running backs, which feels to me like it's going to be kind of running back by committee?
That's the sum will be greater than the parts. And you can tell that there is great coaches on this staff. Like the running backs, I watched them run, I watched them press the hole, and I'm like, man, I can see a little bit of the impression that Kyle Monungai left on the standard of playing running back here. And it all works in unison. You know, the running backs help the offensive line. You have to be able to press the hole and set the blocks. That showed up. That's how they were able to pop some runs. Then all of a sudden, once you are able to establish the run, you can get into play action. We saw Ethan hit about a 40, 50-yard post route over the back of the defense today off of play action. He had all day to throw, so it all works together. And I do believe this offense, I would expect to see them take a step this fall.
Defense is interesting because that's been the identity of the programs under Greg Schiano for years. And last year, it kind of flipped. I mean, the offense was better than the defense. The defense had a lot of injuries. And Greg Schiano did say to us, I didn't want to make excuses during the course of the year, but it's fair to point out in hindsight that there were a lot of guys that we were counting on to be the leaders of that defense who weren't a part of it, or if they were a part of it, were not at 100% a year ago. So totally fair and totally understandable. But the net result was, I mean, they gave up more yards per carry than any team in the Big Ten, which is so uncharacteristic of what you'd expect from Rutgers. They gave up a ton of big plays. Again, uncharacteristic. You have a new defensive coordinator, Rob Smith, who's very familiar with Greg Schiano. This is the third time he's been on his staff here, the fourth time overall if you count the NFL. What did you think of the defense, and how quickly can they get back to playing the kind of football we identify with Schiano?
Yeah, we can go back to last year. Greg, that's not his coaching style. He's not going to make excuses, and the expectation remains. But that being said, some of these new faces that are starters now, they got the opportunity to take some reps when guys went down last year. Well, now here they are starting. Now this is their defense. They brought in some key transfers across the defensive line. I think, again, what stood out is just the type of player and the body type, particularly on the defensive line. Bigger, stronger, stout bodies. That lends favorably to being able to stop the run. I like their linebacker room. Guys have experience there in athleticism. I like their ability to stop the run. The question is, another piece of this is being able to rush the passer. I don't know that I saw a twitchy elite pass rusher on this defense. So what that means is you're going to have to bring in smaller bodies. You might have to pressure your linebackers. You might have to, bring some safety blitzes. Now with these new pieces in the secondary, it's going to be really, really paramount that they are on the same page and communicating so they don't give up these explosive plays.
I think we have to talk about the schedule because it is really difficult. I mean, you look at playing 3 of the 4 Big Ten playoff teams from a year ago. They play Oregon, they play Ohio State, they play Penn State. They also play Illinois, who I think a lot of people feel like could challenge to be in the playoff this year. They play Iowa. I mean, it is a brutal schedule. Even the non-conference are teams that were successful a season ago. So how do you approach this if you're Greg Schiano?
Well, it starts right now. It started in the spring. I mean, you're laying the foundation for the season, and what we saw at practice today was Greg understanding that there's not a ton of margin for error in this roster. So whenever there was a small detail that was less than perfect, Greg would blow the whistle, stop the practice, and it effectively emphasize that to his roster. So leave no stone unturned. They have to be nearly perfect if they want to win some of those big games. But I do think progress can show up even outside of wins and losses. And I do, again, the offense, to me, I would expect to be better. Okay, when I turn on the film, I'll say, is that a good offense or a bad offense? I would expect the offense to be better. I think if you want to win some of these games, the turnovers are going to be key, though.
And I know there is kind of the old adage, you are what your record says you are. And I'm not in any way saying I don't think that they could be over 500 again and get to a bowl game and do all those things. I do think there is a world where you've made those improvements and maybe it isn't reflected in the record just because of how difficult the schedule is. But I will say this. We were talking about the schedule with Greg Schiano, and he said, you know what, we've gotten to the point now where we need to start winning some of those games. And again, they have this albatross hanging over their neck, 41 straight losses against ranked teams. It's the longest losing streak in the power conferences. This is a year to get a breakthrough win.
Yeah, and I just, to that point, I think Coach would agree with this, is before you even talk about wins or losses, there's his keys to the game. Stop the run defensively, tackle well, fly to the ball, play discipline, make plays when you have a chance to force a turnover. Okay, can you do that? On the offensive side of the ball, is the offensive line working in unison? Can you establish the run? Are you assignment sound? Can you protect Athan? Is Athan smart and accurate with the football? If you do all that, you'll be proud regardless, but if you do all that, you'll have a chance to win some of those games.
It's going to be fascinating to see whether they can pull some of that off. But the narrative around this team has been, this is the best roster since Greg Schiano's been back. And I would say, based on what we saw today, Rick, that plays out.
No surprise to see the top of the AVCA preseason volleyball rankings dominated by the Big Ten. Nebraska #1 to start the year, with defending national champ Penn State at #2. Wisconsin, Minnesota, Purdue, UCLA, and USC also among the ranked. As for the Huskers, first-year head coach Danny Busboom Kelly not exactly shying away from expectations, including her own.
Okay, so I'm not surprised. I mean, I get a vote, and I voted ourselves number one. I think we're pretty talented. So we're going to talk about that and talk about what it means to be number one, but we're not going to dwell on that or talk about it for more than about 10 minutes. But I also don't want to avoid it, and I don't think anybody on our team is going to be surprised that we're preseason number one. I also don't think anybody believes that that's what we'll be in December, just because that's what we are right now, because they've been through it all.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of outside noise, and we try and keep that outside of the gym, because when we get in there, it's just us 17 on the court, and it's our coaches. And I mean, I've always heard, like, don't listen to what anybody has to say about you, especially if it's good. Like, you got to just come in and work every single day, and I don't want it to start to affect us and just think, like, oh, we are the best, like, we're going to win. Like, we're not coming in like that. We're coming in with a chip on our shoulder from the last couple of years, and we want to finish it off this year. So really not thinking about that at all.
Of course, Nebraska volleyball trying to replicate what Ohio State football did last year. The defending national champs on the field with one of the biggest storylines. Who plays quarterback? Will it be Julian Sayin, Lincoln Kienholz? We know they have a bevy of talented wide receivers to throw to, like Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate. Smith, one of 4 preseason All-Americans. Caleb Downs, also on that list, one of the best returning defensive players in all of college football. And we have much more on all things OSU football coming your way later tonight. It is the debut of our Ohio State training camp show. The first of multiple showings will air Thursday night at 8 o'clock Eastern right here on the Big Ten Network. And that'll do it for this edition of Big Ten Today. For everyone here at the Big Ten Network, I'm Rick Pizzo. Hope to see you again Friday, noon Eastern.